So in a way, I kind of look at the book a bit as a bit of a penance for the fact that when I was a teenager and a little bit beyond that, I was an ardent Zionist and went on a youth movement program to Israel and all the rest of it. And I was sympathetic to the Palestinian refugees of 1948, but I thought, you know, as refugees everywhere, they should be resettled by the people in the neighboring countries, and that should be fine. So I was a bit naive. So today, I'd like to give a bit of a brief introduction to refusing to be enemies. First, I'll put it a little bit in context. Some of you may be familiar with these four maps. What I like to point out with this series of maps, well, you can clearly see how the green, which is the Palestinian land base, has just gotten smaller and smaller over the years. But one thing that is not always noticed, you know, people will say, well, in 1947, when the UN proposed the partition of Palestine, they were giving roughly half to each side. So why is it that the Zionists were happy with it, even though it wasn't all they wanted, but the Palestinians were not satisfied? Well, all you have to do is look at what they had the year before to see. It's like somebody takes away all your land and gives you half of it back, and you're going to be happy. It's pretty clear, I think. The next map, 49 to 67, is what prevailed between the founding of the State of Israel and the 67 war. So the green then, basically, at the end of the 48 war, Israel had taken over roughly half of the land that had been earmarked for a Palestinian state. Jordan had taken most of the rest, Egypt a little bit. And then we come to 2010. This is really not accurate. It's probably a bit earlier than that, because this over here, there's really much more white and less green now. It's just totally cut by Jewish-only Israeli settlements and the so-called bypass roads that connect the settlements in the West Bank with major cities inside Israel, such as Jerusalem or Tel Aviv, and really obliterate what was called the Green Line, which was the armistice line between Israel and the occupied territories. Now, this is another quick look. Again, this is a map that is not quite up to date. It's from 2002, but it gives you an idea of how many settlements are there. There are more now. And if you want up-to-date information on Israeli settlements in the West Bank, one of the websites on your list is that of the American Friends of Peace Now. And one thing that Peace Now does very well is track settlements and water resources and so on. So you'll see the up-to-date map there, and there'll be even more pock marks on it. And lastly, the map of the wall. You've all heard of what the Israeli authorities refer to as a security barrier, what's commonly known, particularly among activists, as the apartheid wall. As you see here, the blue is not ocean. The blue is everywhere that the wall deviates from the green line. In other words, it's fields that belong to farmers in villages that border the wall. They now can't get to the fields. That's by and large what it is. It's land without people. And it's, you know, even those Palestinians who say, and quite a few Israelis who say, okay, fine, if the Israeli government wants to build a wall for security, that's their privilege. But if so, they should build it on the Green Line and on their side of the Green Line, as if you were building a fence between you and a neighbor that you didn't get along with, on your side. Okay, so that's the context. So that's why there's nonviolent resistance. Palestinian nonviolent resistance goes back even farther than I have listed here. The earliest I found a record of when I was putting this together was 1902. But in fact, Maxine Kaufman-Lacusta, who is a Palestinian nonviolent activist from the Bethlehem area, recently published a book that gives a detailed history of Palestinian nonviolent popular struggle with examples going back to the late 1800s and a lot of references to other books that go into more detail about specifics. It's called Popular Resistance in Palestine, A History of Hope and Empowerment, and I highly, highly recommend it. So sort of the final note in this is that during the first Intifada between 1987 and 93, estimates range between 85 and 95% of the actions called for in the leaflets that were handed out by the unified leadership of the Intifada were for nonviolent actions. Things like strikes, demonstrative funerals, flying the Palestinian flag, even doing anything in the colors of the Palestinian flag, which was outlawed at the time, which were outlawed at the time. Okay, so just quickly, why does an organization choose nonviolence? Well, Huwaida Araf, who was one of the co-founders of the International Solidarity Movement and is now the main person in the Free Gaza movement that's recruiting all these boats that go and break the Gaza siege, said, she quoted Faisal Husseini, who used to say that if you want to fight Mike Tyson, you're not going to do it in the boxing ring. Or as Jonathan Kutab would put it, we can't out-violence the Israelis. So you find a different way to fight, non-violently. Although most joint nonviolent activism in Palestine takes place in the context of cooperation between uninational groups, either through formal coalitions or informal arrangements between Palestinian and Israeli groups, the Action Committee for the Jahalin tribe, like Combatants for Peace and the AIC, the Alternative Information Center, were among the few truly joint ventures that I encountered. It was something that was active for a couple of years in the immediate aftermath of the Oslo Accords. Basically, I walked into the office at the AIC one day, and my boss was just getting off the phone, Mikado, Michel Warshawski, some of you may have run into, and he said, "These are the bulldozers you guys should be stopping." And I said, "What?" And he explained that a Bedouin in an encampment about 12 kilometers outside of Jerusalem had come into East Jerusalem and gone to the Fatah office in the PLO kind of headquarters in East Jerusalem, I should say the Palestinian Authority headquarters in East Jerusalem, which is called Orient House, and it said, "Okay, you got a Palestinian Authority now, you got to help us. We're being displaced by these bulldozers. They want to expand the city of Ma'ale Adumim, which is a settlement, onto the land where we have been sitting for 50 years or so." And so he called Mikado in West Jerusalem and said, "What can you do for us?" So some of us went out and spoke to them, and we said, "Well, what do you want us to do? Do you want us to sit in front of bulldozers with you? Do you want us to organize demonstrations? What?" And very wisely, the person that we were discussing this with mainly said, "Just bring some more people, and we'll sit and talk, and we'll decide what to do." So we did. And so this mixed group of Jahalin, other Palestinians, Israelis, internationals got together, and we did a number of activities. We bought them some time. They were ultimately moved in February of 1997, but by that time, people like Jeremy Milgram, who was at that time active in Rabbis for Human Rights, had helped build up a good relationship with that organization, which in turn hired an effective lawyer and got them a lot better conditions than most Palestinians get. For instance, they got building permits, which is really fabulous, and hook up to electricity and so on. But in the meanwhile, we organized a number of demonstrations, and there's one member of Knesset visible and two rabbis and a rabbi's wife. Anyway, it's a mixed group. So we spent a lot of time sitting around, sometime overnight. Sometimes we'd come in the daytime when we were worried that the bulldozers might be getting too close. And our main weapon, so to speak, was a cell phone. This was the 80s, right? And we would take this big cell phone and we'd sit there, and the idea was that if there was a threat, we would be able to call more activists and the media. Unfortunately, not all of the joint activities of Palestinians and Israelis following the signing of the Oslo Accords in the fall of 2003 were as constructive as the Action Committee for the Jahalin tribe, and most dialogue didn't lead to dedicated anti-occupation activism like that of Neda Golan. Often dialogue and other so-called people-to-people initiatives, not to mention the negotiations of the peace process, were conducted in a sort of vacuum. as if the oppression of the occupation wasn't ongoing. This is a phenomenon that is referred to by the derogatory term of normalization, meaning acting as if things are normal when, in fact, they're far from that. For instance, I was living in Jerusalem in '93, and I didn't leave until 2 years after the signing of the Oslo Accords, so I witnessed both the euphoria of the immediate aftermath following their signing, and the subsequent increase in the spread of Israeli settlements, demolitions of Palestinian homes, construction of bypass roads, and the introduction of increasingly stringent limitations on the movements of Palestinians. Much of this with checkpoints not so much between Palestinian territory and Israel, but within Palestinian territory, and sometimes far from any settlement. Joint activities did continue. Some completely stopped, but others continued and new ones kind of sprang up. They had to be guided by the two principles. One was that they had to be focused, their actions had to be focused on ending the occupation or various abuses that were part of the occupation, such as the wall. And it had to be the Palestinians who decided whether Israelis were coming. It was not appropriate for Israelis to kind of come say, okay, we're going to help you now. And this is a fundamental policy that's now followed strictly by both the International Solidarity Movement and various Israeli organizations engaged in joint struggle. Quickly, what's been some of the nonviolent strategies that have really worked well? Well, repeatedly I was told that the participation of Israelis and internationals was really important. It's been shown to diminish both violence against Palestinian activists and feelings of isolation of Palestinians in general, to humanize Israelis and internationals for Palestinians and vice versa, to effectively get the word out. For instance, Hassan Andoni refers to ISM's practice of what he calls putting the kid from Boston and Balata. If you have a hometown person who goes to one of these places and comes back and tells what they saw with their own eyes, it's going to have a lot more credibility than just seeing something on the news, because we all know how news can be spun. In addition, this strategy has been described as facilitating some semblance of normal life for Palestinians. For instance, enabling farmers to harvest crops unmolested. And I mentioned how Netta Golan's intervention in Haras helped protect villagers there from the harassment by Israeli settlers. Well, Yanun was a village that was totally emptied. All 300 people left at one point because they were being so badly harassed by the neighboring settlers, and the army wasn't doing anything to stop it. Finally, about a third of them were persuaded to go back on the condition that there would be a constant presence of either Israeli or international solidarity people. The main international group involved there was the ecumenical accompaniers.